I think it's important to first think about what the pandemic has done, and that is to really kind of pull back the veneer on the inequalities that are already bubbling away. You mentioned there the gender pay gap, which is very much still rife, and we know that women still take on by far the majority of caring and domestic responsibilities in the home. And what COVID has done is really kind of amplify those challenges and brought them to the fore. But I do think it's perhaps a little simplistic to talk kind of in generational terms. I think there's a bit more nuance needed. If you think about sort of 30, 40 years ago, the Equal Value Amendment was just being passed. Women's engagement in the workplace and in political life and levels of educational qualification have really ramped up since then. And there's been a whole raft of legislation that's been passed. And I don't kind of see a mass exodus of women or perhaps, legislation being repealed. But I do think that risk is perhaps more likely in terms of those gains perhaps being undermined. We've seen during COVID a real lack of focus on women and women's needs in policy planning. And I think, the risk of those gains and equality gains being disregarded and not prioritised is really what I think is, perhaps more of a risk at the moment. So, there's a real need for a gender agenda to ensure that the pay gap does keep closing, but we also need to be addressing the very, very slow rate of closure of that pay gap, which needs, again, greater focus at kind of a policy and government level.
And Wanda Wyporska, you've been working on the fight for equal pay for some time. Would you agree with Rachel on that one?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we need to look at is not just the gender pay gap, as Rachel was referring to, but the other issues in terms of childcare, in terms of the types of jobs that are being created, and the UK's government focus on a construction and infrastructure rebuilding rather than an economy of care, which would actually provide far more jobs and far more for the economy. But we also have to think about what you mentioned in the first place, which was the issue of equal pay, which is the fact that, unfortunately, we still have a lot of women who aren't being paid the same as men for work of the same value or for the same jobs. And that's something that's very much hidden, because in order to find that out, women need to know just what their male counterparts are being paid. And so that's a separate issue, but an equally valid one.
And Rachel, why do you think the pandemic has been so difficult for women in particular? One report I've seen suggests job openings for women dropped by more than 40% compared to just over 10% for men.
Obviously men and women do different kinds of jobs, and that's been a key element really, because we know that women have been more likely to work in shut down sectors. They're more prominent in areas like hospitality or retail or tourism, and those areas have been really hit hardest by national lockdowns. And when you combine that with the fact that women are also more likely to be key workers, there have been increased needs as a result of home school requirements, increased care needs for relatives as well. And we've seen that women have been far more likely to leave jobs or take reduced hours to meet those care needs. We mentioned there that the gender pay gap. So when families are kind of making a decision about who takes those reduced hours, then that, a vicious cycle essentially occurs.
Wanda, countries with large inequalities between genders have lots of other problems too, don't they? Worse mental health, more violent crime and so on. So why do you think that is?
Well, we know that in terms of income inequality, and obviously the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap, and here in the UK, the class pay gap, all contribute to that and are all different manifestations of that. But we know that in countries with high levels of income inequality, such as the UK, such as the US, we also see higher levels of poor mental health, poor physical health, drug and alcohol addiction, violent crime, incarceration. We see lower levels of educational attainment, lower levels of trust, which of course is essential in a democracy and in time of a pandemic. So the wider impacts are much broader than just what's in people's pay packets. It also determines those issues around health. And if COVID has shown us anything, it's that health is deeply, deeply linked to our living and material standards. So we've seen, particularly here in the UK, but worldwide, that the pandemic has hit hardest in areas of deprivation.
And to help recognise those inequalities, should all companies around the world publish gender pay figures?
Well, I think that would be a great start. But what I think is equally important is that companies have transparency around pay, and that affects discrimination, it affects promotion, it allows people to see where the pay bands are, and to have a transparent structure would bring a lot more equality into our workplaces, as well as, for example, showing the salary when you're advertising jobs. We know that one of the drivers of inequality is to have those different pay bands and different pay settings. So, for example, if I go for a job and I'm asked what my former salary was against a man whose salary probably would be higher because of labour market discrimination, then, you know, that company is perpetuating those labour market gaps. So we would say to everybody, yes, show your salaries, have transparent salary bands, and publish your pay gaps.
And Rachel, how is it, do you think, we're still having to have this conversation? What needs to be done now going forward to bridge this gender gap?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's been over 50 years in the UK since the Equal Pay Act was passed, and, you know, longer since those provisions across Europe. You know, change has been glacially slow. The norms and kind of values and cultures that need changing are deeply embedded, and I think greater transparency is really critically important. I know that the EU published a proposed directive in March of this year, where they're looking at, you know, greater transparency measures. So beyond just pay reporting, but thinking about salary history banning. So I also think the question of flexibility is really important. You know, the idea around flexibility at work has been kind of bounced around for years now, but yet COVID has really proven that, quite inadvertently, but proven that it's possible, and that can be a real game changer. But that needs to not just be flexibility for women, it needs to also be flexibility for men, because we've seen that when men apply for flexibility, they're more likely to be turned down, and we know that they apply a lot less, and that kind of reflects those very deeply embedded values around care in society. So I think embedding flexibility, ensuring that jobs are all advertised on a flexible basis, and improving transparency are two really critical areas where developments could be made.
And Wanda, perhaps post-pandemic, there could be a reset. Can that work to perhaps reset gender equality?
Well, I'd like to think so, but unfortunately, history tells us otherwise. I think we may see some small incremental gains in terms of individual practice and organisations, but I think, as Rachel said, this is about a bigger issue. It's about childcare, it's about caring responsibilities, it's about how we see, coming back to the stereotypes we were talking about, how we see the role of men and women, how we see this occupational segregation that we have, where women are more likely to go into some roles and less likely to go into others, and also women more likely to go into part-time roles because of caring responsibilities. So, you know, if we were to have this reset, it would have to be fundamental. It would have to quite literally be from the cradle upwards, and I'm not confident that society is actually going to do that at this stage.
Wanda Wyporska from the Equality Trust and Rachel Verdin from the University of Sussex Business School. Many thanks to you both for joining us on the agenda.